Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, February 23rd. This week, the death of Alexei Navalny, the charismatic opposition leader in Russia, raises profound questions for the future of Russia and is further evidence of a growing global trend of rising impunity. Governments around the world are getting away with murder, literally, and other many unlawful acts. How can we make sure that they are ultimately held to account? Then the war in Gaza raises similar questions of impunity, although here the International Court of Justice is hearing evidence of possible breaches of international law. But it also raises profound questions about Israel's relationships with the rest of the world, including increasingly with a Biden administration that is becoming more and more vocal about the need to end the fighting and take care of the people in Gaza. And then finally, we take a look at the conversations that were happening in Munich last weekend. There we found European leaders increasingly sensing that they're caught between a Putin that is becoming more and more militaristic and a United States that is less and less interested in helping them out to deal with that threat. And here to talk about these issues are three reporters who covered these stories. Deborah Amos, formerly an international correspondent at NPR, is now the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. DeYoung is Senior National Security Correspondent at The Washington Post. And Steve Erlagner, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for The New York Times. Good morning, good afternoon for Deb and Steve, who are in Berlin. Wonderful to have all of you back on the show. Deb, let's start with you. The Navalny murder, because that's what it was, although we don't know who actually did the dastardly deed, but the state itself was certainly responsible for it, really raises fundamental questions about what can happen in terms of the opposition in Russia, but also this question of a Russian state that is out there murdering its own citizens, both inside Russia and increasingly outside Russia. How do we deal with this?
So Russian immunity, Ivo, is not new from Chechnya to Syria, and we pay more attention to it in Ukraine, certainly in the Western press. Russian war tactics have been the same, bombing hospitals, infrastructure, civilian homes. David Miliband, who's the head of the International Rescue Committee, at some moment declared that we were in the era of impunity, and his simple definition, I think, stands, which is when they can get away with anything, they'll do everything. In 2003, the UN rapporteur on torture said that the Russian torture in Ukraine was state policy. Putin crashed the Munich Security Conference last week with this announcement that Navalny had died under suspicious circumstances. Even after that, there was another Russian dissident who was killed in Spain, shot repeatedly, run over by his own car. There's also been more attacks on the press. There's two more that have been outlawed. One is Article 19. The other is Radio Free Europe. Anybody who works for either of those two outlets can face fines and can face jail terms. But I think you also have to say that part of Russian impunity is the failure of international law and legal structures. The International Criminal Court issued a arrest warrant for Putin for reportedly kidnapping Ukrainian children and bringing them back to Russia. But unless he's willing to show up in The Hague, the arrest warrant will stand, but a trial is unlikely. There's no way to get an international war crimes tribunal through the Security Council because Russia has a veto. And the ICC doesn't have a way to take him to court either. So it's kind of a grim picture on impunity. There's really little that the West can do. And Putin's made it clear that whatever they've done won't stop him.
It is a grim picture. I mean, in some ways, Steve, this is what international relations is about. There is no larger enforcing power that can, as you have in a well-functioning rule of law state. Although even in states, it doesn't always work that way, even in the best-run states. But nevertheless, there's this growing concern, certainly among civil societies, about this rise of impunity, about the fact that Russia is running around and doing what it did. It was certainly at Munich, which we'll talk about later, topic number 1, 2, and 3. The fact that this could happen. So, how should we think about this as we try to figure out a way to punish those who are engaged in those activities in order, presumably, to deter them from not doing it again in the future?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is think about the world realistically and not pretend we're in some Rousseauian version of the world that doesn't exist. Power matters. Russia matters. The United Nations was always flawed. Its flaws are more evident now than ever before, given the rise of Brazil, the change in the balance of power, economic, demographic since World War II. And also, a lot of the things we've signed on for at the UN seem a bit out of date, like the Refugee Convention. I mean, that's a big issue all over the world. What to do about migration? The Refugee Convention dates from World War II. It doesn't recognize people fleeing desertification and climate change as actual refugees. So there's lots of ways in which the world order could be improved if you could get the powers of the world to agree to do that. That's the harder thing, because Russia and China, China rising, Russia more aggressive, shrinking, but more aggressive, want to overturn this very order we're complaining about. And one of the ways they do it is by treating it with impunity, by ignoring it. And it's a very sad picture, but what we do about it, I'm not really sure. One thing we can do about it is make sure Putin doesn't conquer Ukraine. That would be one big help. But it would also be a help if we could apply the same standards we like to apply to Russia, to other countries in the world, including Israel, in Gaza, and that we give the rest of the world, the so-called global south, whatever that misnomer is, more of a voice in trying to help us restructure a world order that both is realistic and actually works.
Big challenges, Karen, for sure. But so comment on that, and also remember, President Biden said to Putin that if Navalny were to die, there would be very serious consequences. The United States has just announced major sanctions. Are those sanctions going to be enough? Is that the kind of major consequences that is going to prevent Putin from continuing to do what he's doing?
You know, I think it's really hard to see sanctions as being an effective tool for most people, at least. Certainly, the goal here in these sanctions today is to have more countries adhere to these caps on what they can pay for Russian oil. I think, the downside of that is that if there's less Russian oil on the market, then the price of oil globally will increase. You can look at the Russian economy. According to international analysts, it grew by 3% last year, which was more than the U.S. economy grew, and that was with all these sanctions. There have been discoveries that certain munitions in Ukraine that the Russians have used include technology from the West, from Europe, and from the United States. These sanctions are going to crack down on those. But I think that, as Steve said, power is power. I think as long as the Russian economy stays afloat, which it seems, thank you very much, to be doing, it's hard to see what the sanctions are accomplishing. They're already banned from the Western financial systems. They already have restrictions on what they can sell and restrictions on what they can buy, but they're still selling and buying. So I think there are limits on it. And just on Gaza, I think, Deb's absolutely right about the limits of what you can do. The United States this week, for the third time, vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the UN General Assembly. And this sort of, everybody voted for it except the Brits, which abstained, and apparently they had a big internal fight over whether they should vote for the resolution or abstain. But the fact is that even if everybody voted for a ceasefire resolution, which theoretically is supposed to be binding under international law, all these systems that we've set up, I doubt it would have any effect at all. I mean, Israel's not paying a whole lot of attention to this, and the international community doesn't have many tools to force them to do that. And so the system as it stands kind of depends on international opprobrium and criticism, but it doesn't look like that's accomplished much. Certainly not in the case of Israel and Gaza, and certainly not in the case of Russia and Ukraine and these assassinations.
I'd say one thing in Germany, and there was a group of Ukrainian judges who were here about 2 weeks ago, and they went to Nuremberg, and then they were in Berlin. And the idea was to get them ready for an international, or for a tribunal in Ukraine, which is, there's going to be a domestic trial. And when they went to the German foreign ministry, they were told, don't dawdle, get this trial going, do it before the US election. And the implication was, if Trump is elected, you won't have the support that you got in the Biden administration. The 4 years of the last Trump administration, there was no one in the position that Beth Van Schaak is now, which is a UN ambassador for war crimes and accountability. That position was not filled for 4 years. And I think that what the foreign ministry here was warning is, you better move now, because you may not have that support if Trump wins the election.
I think that's true. Not clear to how much that would actually accomplish as part of this larger power issue, but it is important. Accountability ought to be at least also internationally recognized guilt, which is for example, the ICC indictment of Putin and the person responsible for taking care of children, most of whom are kidnapped. Steve, you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to ask Karen a question in Washington. Do you think the U.S. missed an opportunity by vetoing that ceasefire resolution, the third one, to send a signal to Israel that might have been useful, or how did you look at it?
Well, I think sort of with domestic politics, it would be very hard for the administration to do, because they're kind of getting it from both sides. Obviously, there are a lot of people on the left who are very critical of the administration and much more supportive of the Palestinians. There are people on the other side who are very critical of the administration speaking out on behalf of Gazan civilians and being publicly critical of Israel. So it's a really can't-win situation for them. Could they have abstained? That would have been a huge move.
Yeah.
A huge move for them. And I think that their calculation is that it would only drive Israel in the opposite direction at a time when they're really wanting to get this hostage deal accomplished.
Yeah, because what I was kind of wondering, and obviously I don't know, I'm not there, is that this time I suspect there really was a debate inside, but my guess is Biden's gut was always going to go this way. But I think
also they truly believe, and I can talk more about this, talking about what's happening with Gaza, but I think that they truly believe that a ceasefire resolution, a real ceasefire resolution, stop fighting, end this war forever, is not only useless but harmful, because it gives Hamas something without getting anything, and that's why they're pushing for this hostage deal.
Karen, in fact, let's switch over to this, because it is it's apropos to what you just said. I mean, the administration is trying to figure out. They've been trying to figure out for almost 5 months now. How do you gain leverage over Israel? On the one hand, by a strong belief that comes out of Biden's core that you need to support Israel, that after October 7, anything but supporting Israel is not acceptable. And just isn't part of his gestalt, to use a German term. But also increasingly inside the administration, from the vice president, the secretary of state, increasingly the sense that Israel's gone too far. And by the way, it's not working. That in fact, you're not destroying Hamas in the way that you were hoping to. And so how do you gain leverage? Help us sort of understand what was going on. You talked about the UN resolution, which may be too blunt an instrument, but how are they trying to get to that point, and what leverage do they think they have?
Well, they really have put all of their eggs at the moment into this hostage negotiation basket, and believe that nothing good is going to happen until if and when they get this deal. The deal is that there would be a 6-week pause in fighting, which the one concession they made this week to others in the Security Council was they called it a temporary ceasefire, which is the first time they've publicly used the word ceasefire, as soon as practicable, which sort of defeated the purpose of calling it a ceasefire. But in any case, the good news, to the extent there is any, is that everybody's back in Paris today. Bill Burns, the CIA director, who's been the chief U.S. negotiator on this, the prime minister of Qatar, the foreign minister and intelligence guys of Egypt, the head of Mossad, the head of Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Everybody says they're making progress, but they don't give any details. The idea is, if you get them to all stop fighting for 6 weeks, during which Hamas would release the civilian hostages and in exchange for some prisoners that are being held by the Israelis, and the humanitarian aid would start to flow in a way that it would actually make a difference in Gaza, that maybe then they could sort of slip in and say, it would be long enough that they would say, oh, nobody really wants to go back to this fighting. Now we've all seen what happens when we're not fighting. People get fed, people don't get killed, and so let's keep this going. And again, the United States believes that it's only within a framework like that, where both sides have to give something to get something, that they'll actually, actually make progress. As I was saying, the Biden administration is in an increasingly difficult situation, both domestically and internationally. Right now, the president can barely give a speech or travel anywhere in Washington, outside of Washington, without pro-Palestinian demonstrators showing up and kind of reviving the old Vietnam slogans, how many kids did you kill today? And things like that. I mean, I suspect that many of those protesters are not particularly well versed in the history of conflict in the Middle East. But in any case, it does have a moral sort of impetus to it. You've got problems in Congress on both sides, which are preventing things from passing. Internationally, you saw at the G20 meeting in South America this week, Secretary Blinken, there was a leaked video out of a private meeting that some of the leaders had that was supposed to be closed, but somebody left a microphone on, and a lot of reporters heard it, and it was just ruthless against Blinken and what the United States is doing, and basically nobody stood up for the U.S. position. Again, everything sort of hinges on this agreement. The other hope is that when you get this pause, that you can present the outlines of a kind of final solution, if I can use that phrase. That you've got a small group of Arab countries and the United States that are working very hard to come up with some specific things along a specific timeline, that as soon as the fighting stops, even temporarily, they say, well, here's what we're prepared to do. Israel doesn't make any of this any easier. And as the Americans become ever more outspoken in criticizing Israeli tactics, and they announced their own red lines. No military offensive in Rafah under current conditions. No Israeli military control of Rafah after this ends. No buffer zone by Israel on Palestinian territory, and ultimately a transition to Palestinian Authority rule over the West Bank and Gaza and a Palestinian state. The Netanyahu government has become ever more intransigent, at least publicly. Now, the Americans keep saying you get a different story in private. I don't know how true that is, but they have waffled on their plans for Rafah and have not made any commitments. They've continued attacking humanitarian convoys and making it ever more difficult to get through. Last night, Netanyahu released their own plan, Israeli security control, a buffer zone, no Palestinian Authority in Gaza. So it really was just the opposite of what the administration has been saying. I mean, obviously, Netanyahu has his own political problems, but I think that this is not outside the realm of what he would like to see happen. And meanwhile, the aid situation was just in total collapse for lots of reasons, which we can go into if you want. But I'll end that now. It's a real mess.
No, so
Can I ask a question about deadlines? Yeah. I have been reading that Ramadan is a deadline of some kind, and that the administration, certainly the people of Gaza, would like it to be resolved by Ramadan because they will observe it. And is that a deadline? And if they don't make that deadline, then what?
Well, you've got the feeling is that if you don't have even a temporary ceasefire started before Ramadan, that will allow more aid to flow, the situation is going to get far worse in Gaza. And it's hard to see how it can get much worse than it already is. And also, you've got the more extremist elements in Netanyahu's government who control security forces have already said that they're going to limit access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem during Ramadan, that's part of Ramadan. Everybody goes to Al-Aqsa to pray, as you, Deb, know better than anybody else. The feeling is that the West Bank is going to explode if that happens, and that the situation in Gaza is going to get worse than it even already is. And so they want something to happen by then.
And of course, the Israelis are using Ramadan as their deadline for going into Rafah.
And Ramadan starts on March 10th for those
March 10th,
who don't pay close attention to those things.
Steve,
I've covered a war in Gaza during Ramadan, so this can happen too. Sorry, Ivo, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, and it likely is to happen. Steve, you spent a lot of time in Israel and talking to a lot of Israelis since October 7th, and of course, was bureau chief there a while ago. I mean, help us understand Netanyahu's one-page principles that he released overnight, which basically took the American red lines and then crossed them all out.
Moved them all.
I mean, and I think the way that Karen described it was exactly right. Here are the U.S. red lines, and he went exactly on the opposite direction, every single one of them.
Well, this is what he laid out was really what his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, laid out 6-7 weeks ago.
Right.
It's not really different. It's Israel's going to maintain security control for a long time. There's going to be a buffer zone, including around the Egyptian border, which the Egyptians are not happy about at all. That there would be some kind of technocratic Palestinian leadership in Gaza. He doesn't believe in a revitalized Palestinian Authority, or at least not right away. No, it was very hard line and very much aimed at his own people. But at the same time, it's kind of where they are, to be honest. The IDF, the Israeli military, sees this whole year as going in and out of Gaza to disrupt, destroy Hamas wherever they find it. after Rafah, and I'm sure they're going to go into Rafah because strategically they can't not go into Rafah. They have to go to the border to try to get rid of the rest of Hamas in their minds, right? I'm just telling you what they think. Then they will pull troops back. They'd hope for a big hostage release. That's great. But they would like to treat Gaza the way they treat Nablus, which is basically that there be a Palestinian authority or government in Gaza, like in the West Bank, that doesn't like Israel, maybe hates Israel, but isn't fighting Israel. And that their troops would be in this buffer zone on the margins, not occupying most of Gaza, but would go in and out of Gaza the way they go in and out of Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarem in the West Bank when they have intelligence and feel there's something to do. And they would do that with small groups of commando-like forces. That's the IDF dream. The IDF dream isn't victory. It's continued security control. Because quite a lot of people, when they think about the faults of the 2005 Gaza withdrawal, when Israel pulled everything out of Gaza, it was a good idea to pull the settlements out, but maybe they should have left the army in. And this time, I don't think they want to make that mistake. Now, the rest of the world will hate this, and it puts a big hole in the Biden dream, but I think that's where the Israelis are. Now, if the Bibi government falls, if Benny Gantz comes in, who's part of the security cabinet, but is the main opposition figure and certainly the most popular politician now in Israel, Benny Gantz, who's center-right, but more center than right, I think would listen to the Americans much more and would at least get into the process. I mean, not to promise a Palestinian state, but certainly to talk about a mechanism and a revitalized Palestinian Authority, and so on and so on. But under this government, I don't think so. And I mean, I also do think before Israel agrees to a hostage agreement, it wants to go further into Rafah. Again, I hope I'm wrong, but that's my sense of where they are.
I think that one, if I may, one important thing is it's really not possible to overestimate the Israeli obsession with the hostages. I think that is the be-all and end-all of popular opinion there. And the administration is hoping that if it can get the hostages out of there, that it can start to flip the political script inside Israel.
That's true. But sometimes Israeli officials are saying to me, 130 people, they expect at least half of them to be dead. And the other thing that drives the Israelis crazy is that the ICRC, well, I'm telling you what they're telling me, maybe they're lying. Yeah. But they're also very upset that the ICRC can't get in to see the hostages, can't see who's alive, who's dead, their condition, and this is part of why politically aid to Gaza is so controversial. Again, I'm just describing it, not supporting it. But, it's a tough mood there. They're very traumatized and, they don't want Hamas to emerge claiming victory.
But it's been surprising to me that the hostages, as far as the Netanyahu government, is not a number one priority. I've never seen Israel do that before. Hostages have always been at the top of the list. And you sense from the families that they're surprised by it too. And that is part of why I think Netanyahu is unpopular, because it feels like they've been abandoned. I'm
talking about public opinion, I think, is more, we've got to get the hostages out. Yeah.
No, it's true. And then the protests of the families can build into more political protests. I think that's actually what the Americans would like. And then Gantz leaves the government, and then somehow there's so much political pressure that Bibi has to call new elections. Because I think, my understanding from the Americans, and it depends which Americans you're talking to, and you have better access to them than I do, but I was in Munich talking to some of them. they just think you need a new Israeli government for this to work, and you need a new Palestinian Authority for this to work.
Sure.
And so, in a way, they're kind of quietly trying to do those things without, Karen, as you so rightly said, coming out so publicly against Netanyahu that it helps him rather than hurts him.
I do wonder, though, and I think we're all watching this as closely as we can. And yes, the Israeli public wants the hostages released, but they also want to make sure that October 7th never happens. And they do buy into the IDF strategy overall, that this is the way to do that. And it's never been clear to me how to square those two goals, other than through the IDF's argument that it's military pressure that will ultimately lead to the release of the hostages, which is a hard argument, given that the hostages are there, in fact, to withstand the military pressure. So that that's their purpose. So I've never understood how you square that circle. But even if the hostages get released, it strikes me the public will want to go back into and support more or less the kinds of ways in which the IDF and maybe not quite where Netanyahu is in terms of the security structure for Gaza, but it's not going to be. Doesn't strike me they're very close to where the Biden administration is, let alone where MBS and the Saudis are, who have a very different view of the future. And I'm not sure that the Israelis ultimately care what the rest of the world thinks, because their security is at stake, and we've seen that over the last five months. It doesn't strike me that Gaza is having a lot of impact on Israeli politics. I mean, the situation inside Gaza.
Full circle about the question of impunity and whether the world system is equipped to deal with this kind of thing.
Exactly.
Either in Gaza or in Russia.
Exactly. And before jumping into Munich, there's one other issue that and I don't know whether any of you have been following this, but apparently there's been pictures and reports of a big, huge area being prepared south of the Rafah border in Egypt. Presumably because the Egyptians, while they have been very vocal that they don't want anybody to cross the border, may be preparing for the reality that hundreds of thousands, if not more, Gazans will escape the onslaught from the Israelis across the border. Anything we're hearing there on that? I mean, the Egyptians are very strong on this publicly, but they seem to be preparing for something.
I think you're absolutely right. They are. They have said publicly. I don't know if it was the foreign minister or who just say, look, we don't want, Gazans should stay in Gaza. But I think they're well aware that if, the Israelis have already blown one hole in the wall with Egypt at Rafah. If that wall comes down by whatever means, what they don't want is 1.5 million Palestinians running freely into Egypt and going wherever they want. They've got a lot of military forces on the border there now. And I think the plan is, if it comes to that, to basically round them all up and put them in this place that has very high walls that they've been constructing a few miles away.
A prison within
That's what I hear too.
Within the prison, yeah. I mean, the Egyptians, I think they have also said that they would not only suspend, but they may end the peace agreement with Israel.
Yeah.
Of course.
If it happens, the Arab world, walks away, it will be hugely symbolic if that happens.
Yeah. Just another upbeat part of this story to be talking about. Steve, give us some upbeat news on. We were both in Munich. It was
sunny.
It was sunny. The rain held off for most of the time.
No snow and ice.
None of that, and the beer was plenty, as was the Wurst, as they say. But what was your big takeaway from the meeting? It seemed to me to be a different kind of meeting that we've seen for a while. A level of anxiety that is pretty hard to describe, although pretty easy to understand.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I've tried to think of the adjective. The adjective I've come up with is unmoored. I mean, people are just not sure what's holding in the Ukrainian border, right? What's holding in the international system, the place of Europe in that system, whether the Republican Party is on its way to being Trump Party and nothing else, whether the world's superpower is really dysfunctional, whether they're going to have to deal again with an unpredictable transactional president who seems to govern from what his stomach is telling him every day. And no one's assuming that's going to happen, but they're taking it very seriously. And they're also taking very seriously the fall of Avdiivka, the worry that Ukraine's army may crack this July, that in fact, the real effort this year will be for Ukraine to hold the lines it now has. And if the Americans don't come up, if the American Congress doesn't come up with this $60 billion dollars in funding for more military aid, what do? I mean, can the Europeans buy the shells from the Americans somehow, since the Americans can't buy them for themselves? And if it doesn't come through, can Ukraine hold on? It can hold on, but would it lose a significant amount of territory? And that brings all kinds of questions again about whether, and here I'm very skeptical, but others are not, particularly Central Europeans, that Putin, if he succeeds, I'm sorry about that Putin, if he succeeds, will in the next 3 or 4 years try to test NATO's resolve in the Balkans or elsewhere. So this brings Europeans, I think, more to the view that Emmanuel Macron said just as Trump was elected the first time, that Europe should do more in its own defense, that it's rich enough and big enough to, he now talks about improving the European pillar within NATO. But I mean, there really is now new discussion of how to fund a European deterrent inside NATO. What would NATO be like with less America or even no America? How big a threat is Russia? The nature of the relationship with China? And of course, the Navalny death, which some people thought was tied to Munich as a message, resounded deeply because for the reasons of impunity that we talked about earlier, but also because it just felt like Putin felt he was on a ride, and he was basically giving 2 fingers to the West. And this, I think, was the mood. So there was both a sense of new commitments to defense, a new seriousness, but also real anxiety about where the U.S. was heading, whether Trump gets elected or not.
Deb, I think that's a great description, and I think the thing that struck me most, and I wonder as you walk the streets of Berlin, what you're hearing, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a more general sense that a possibility of a real military confrontation between NATO and Russia exists. Radek Sikorski, now new, again, Polish foreign minister, said, we told you 15 years ago that he was coming and you didn't believe us. We told you 10 years ago. We told you 5 years ago and that he was coming. Now, please believe us. And I had a sense that there are people in Western Europe who are starting to believe it, that this is very serious. More in the Nordic countries than probably the people on the streets in Berlin, but serious German politicians also thinking that this is something we haven't thought about for 30 years, even though there's been a hot war in Ukraine, but that's in Ukraine and NATO will survive. It will be strong. We'll be able to deter it. How do you see it? What do you guess?
So we know that there will be big protests and demonstrations on Saturday in front of the Bundestag for the anniversary of the invasion. All of my Ukrainian students will be there. There's polls now in Germany and across Europe that are inching towards more than majority that worry that Ukraine will lose. It is a very gloomy mood. And part of that is because of the United States. And part of that is because many here think the Germans haven't done quite enough and didn't take it seriously enough. And the time period when Europe is ready to go it alone is far. 5 years, 10 years, that's what people are talking about here. So I think that is contributing to the gloomy mood. People are watching Washington, but they're also looking at their own sense of what do we need to do and how fast can we do it.
Karen, you're in Washington, and I think what struck me was Washington's voice was not really that strong, or people weren't listening. Kamala Harris gave a speech. Blinken was on a panel. The Vice President of the United States. Usually, that's a pretty big deal, and somehow the mood was already. It's not really clear that these are the people who are going to be making the decisions. Not because they may lose or not lose, but because they're no longer. Washington is not being controlled by the kinds of people who we can count on.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there. I wasn't in Munich, but I think that's right. I think that there's not much new for them to say that they haven't already said. You listen to these speeches on Ukraine, and they've shifted a bit to be, for the world to step up, to the Republicans to step up, but the gist of it is the same. I think Blinken on Gaza, it's not new. For months now he's been saying this stuff, and there's a feeling that I think it's all sort of words because nothing seems to be changing very much, and so people are starting to, as others have said here, to turn more inward and toward themselves, saying, "What are we going to do about this?" Not so much where is this going, because they can see where it looks like it's going, and they feel like they ought to be thinking seriously about it before it's gone.
So I guess that leaves the big question: has American power already waned? We've talked about its inability to influence Putin and what he's doing with regard to his opponents. We've talked about Gaza and Israel and the inability to really get the Israelis to move in a direction that the administration has long sought, and now on Ukraine, and even the core of American, what Obama used to call the cornerstone of America's engagement in the world, NATO, no longer able to really sway there. Are we living in what Fareed Zakaria a while ago called the post-American world? Is
the end
that
times?
What we're seeing?
Yeah, I think everybody's bated breath until the election. Everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen, not only in the White House but also in Congress.
So I guess. I mean, let's leave it. We'll talk about the elections more, but I guess the question is: are Europeans and others already starting to give up, no matter who wins? Yes, it's going to be really bad if Trump wins, but it's not really clear that things are going to be that different if Biden wins, because he already has lost that influence. I think that's sort of a question that I think we ought to raise in the back of our minds as we watch what is happening in the next 3, 4, 5 months, even before the election, and of course after. It's keeps us busy, that's for sure. Fantastic conversation. Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post, Steve Erlagner of the New York Times, Deborah Amos, formerly of NPR, now of Princeton University. Thank you all three for joining us, and thank you for tuning in for this edition of World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.